Hello, everyone. So welcome to a new section of Getting into the Weeds, dialing into the irrigations seminar series hosted by Perennia. My name is Hugh. I'm the wild blueberry specialist with Perennia. My co-host is Karen Condon. She is acting vegetable specialist and the field crop specialist in Perennia. And today our topic is PV and guns irrigation system management. So before we start, I will uh, have some housekeeping messages for you for Zoom. So all participants will have their audio and video turned off during the webinar. But if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of this screen. And if you prefer, you can ask question in the chat function as well. Karen is going to be our monitor for this Q&A and chat, so she will monitoring the Q&A and chats to see if there's any question or comments during the presentation and at the end of the presentations. And just a little bit background on Perennia. I know a lot of you already know Perennia, but just in case you don't know, our vision is Nova Scotia is a recognized world leader in producing innovative, environmentally responsible, safe food and of impeccable quality. And our mission is to supporting growth, transformation, and economy development in Nova Scotia's agriculture, seafood, and food and beverage sectors. So our service included agriculture, quality and food safety, product development, lab services, and fisheries. I also like to share two of interesting digital series from the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Fishery and Aquaculture and Nova Scotia's Sea Farmers digital series. So those information can be found in Perennia's website. I encourage you to attend. Those are the digital series to recognize contribution and achievement we have in agriculture in Nova Scotia. So our getting into weeds, dialing into irrigation seminar series started from last year in November. We have topics covering from influence of soil on management crops during drought and also planning, design, operating and management of drought drip irrigation systems. So if you missed those live sections, but you are interested to review them again, you can go to our YouTube channel. So I highlight on the bottom here, getting into the weeds winter workshop series. We also have other interesting videos in our YouTube channel. I welcome you all to review and maybe you will find something you like. So today our topic is on PV and guns irrigation system management. At the end of this section, we also have CEU critic available for today's section. So the details will be shared at the end of this section. I would like to introduce our guest speakers today. The first one is Dr. Franklin Gaudi. So Dr. Gaudi is the project manager of the Irrigation Training and Research Center at Cal Poly from California. He teaches various irrigation and water management courses at Cal Poly. So Dr. Gaudi is a certified irrigation designer in the surface, drip, micro, and sprinkler. Also, he's a certified irrigation contractor and a certified agricultural irrigation specialist through the Irrigation Association. And Dr. Gaudi's current areas of interest are utilizing domestic wastewater for agriculture, forage crops, and landscape irrigation design and auditing. And our next guest is William Spurr. He is a field management at Spurr Brothers Farm, and he's a fifth generation vegetable and fruit farmer in the Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia. So they manage approximately 1,000 acres using trickler, sprinkler, gun, and PV irrigation systems. They have crops for the early market, and also they manage their crops in very sandy soils in their operation. And they irrigate potatoes, onions, and carrots on a large scale with a gun and PV irrigation system, and they adapt their schedule to the rainfall and different soil types in Nova Scotia. So he's going to share his experiments in managing those different irrigation system in their farms. So I'm going to turn the stage over to Dr. Gaudi. He's going to share his presentation and start today's presentation. So Dr. Gaudi.
All right. Hugh, I think I need you to unshare your screen so I can.
Okay.
Thank you.
There we go.
Right. So today, I'm going to be helping you out a little bit with the getting into the weeds, I guess we're calling this, right, on pivots and guns. And I've been teaching at Cal Poly State University over here in San Luis Obispo, California, since 2008, and so I've done a lot of project work, and so a lot of these photos that I'm going to be showing you today are from projects that I've worked on and so forth. But before we kind of get into that, though, there's one big reason that I think we need to cover. We need to understand for understanding how pivots and guns, what the purpose of them is ultimately. So, and that's distribution uniformity. I should tell you guys, if you have any questions along the way, please go ahead and type it in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer them as we're going along here. Yeah, feel free to interact with me a little bit. I know it's kind of tough on a webinar, but don't be shy. Ask questions. So distribution uniformity, this is how evenly we apply the water to the field. Ultimately, we want every plant in the field to get the same amount of water, right? That's the goal. Assuming that all the plants are the same in the field, they should all require the same amount of water. So we want to apply that water as uniformly as possible. Typically, we express this as a decimal value. So you'll be seeing probably some numbers today on my presentation, and we would say that a distribution uniformity of 1 is perfect. Okay, and I'll show you the little equation here in just a moment so you understand what the equation is on how we compute this. And typically with pivots and linear moves, we can achieve a distribution uniformity of 0.9 or better. With drip, we can also achieve 0.9 or better. Surface irrigation, we can also do pretty well if the conditions are right. But today we're going to focus on pivots and guns, and I just want to give you an idea here on how we can, how you can evaluate, and also how you can ensure that you're getting good uniformity out there in the field. Because ultimately, the uniformity is the yield, right? If you're not applying the water uniformly, then you're probably not growing the crop uniformly. And if the crop's not growing uniformly, then you're not getting the best yield you can. So, here in California, we go through extended periods of drought. I'm sure you guys get those every once in a while up there, but here it's really a big deal because we don't have water's a limited resource, and so we can't just over irrigate in the process of trying to get good yield. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And as water gets more expensive, this is the stuff that you probably should really understand here. So here's just a little graphic describing uniformly visually, right? The first picture there shows us that we have some crops or some plants in our field that are not getting enough water. And then we have other spots in our field here where we're getting, a little bit too much water, right? So this area right in here is being over irrigated, and this area right over here is being under irrigated. And so this is a problem because of our irrigation system. If the irrigation system was working properly, we wouldn't have that problem. So ultimately, if we were somehow able to take this water here and then move it over into this location here, right, we would end up then with what we have down at the bottom, which is a nice uniform application of water. And that application of water would be, a very high distribution uniformity, 0.95, something like that, right? And then, of course, we're never going to be perfect, right? And you'll see why as we go through the presentation here, but we can get close. And so that's the main purpose of our irrigation systems, is to apply the water as uniformly as possible. And if you're, if you do maintenance on your systems, you pay attention to the systems, you can keep that distribution uniformity high. And of course, it has to start with a good design. So you got to be talking to irrigation dealers that you're buying your equipment from that know what they're doing, because if you don't, then you know, you're probably going to you could get a system that performs like the top graphic there right off the bat, and that's not good, right? We want to start with that good uniformity and then try to keep it there. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about pivots and guns today and how we can try to keep it there. So you know, here's the equation for it. So distribution uniformity is the average of the low quarter divided by the average of all. And so the simplistically, what you would do is you would put buckets out across the field, and I'll show you this in just a few minutes here. But you put buckets out across the field and you run this, you can see that center pivot. You can run that center pivot over the buckets. And in theory, if every single bucket had the exact same amount of water, then the distribution uniformity would be perfect. And again, it's not going to be. So what we do is we look at, let's just say you put 80 buckets out there, right? A quarter of 80 is 20 buckets. So we'd look at the average of the lowest 20 buckets, right? So you'd measure up all the buckets, you'd look at the average of the lowest 20, and then you compare that to the average of all 80 buckets. And ultimately, that's how we compute the distribution uniformity, okay? So looking at this picture here, you can see that the pivot in the foreground actually has a very good distribution uniformity. I mean, that crop looks very healthy all the way around. If you look at the picture in the background there, it looks like maybe right around in here, right, we kind of have a dry spot. But I would argue that that's probably not a function of the machine because it is localized. If it was a problem with the machine, you would most likely notice that that dry spot would go all the way around the machine because the machine ultimately is going around in a circle, right? And so if you have some sprinklers that are plugged, that's going to be visual all the way around the machine. So, you know, don't think that you see a spot like that, that might be a machine problem. That actually might be a soils issue or something, right? Where we don't have the nutrients that we need. And so identifying the differences between the irrigation system and then the maybe problems with the soil is something that, you know, you need to work on too. So, but if it's definitely, you know, going all the way around, then, you know, it's probably machine related. So here's the weeds, right? I know you want to probably understand these 4 factors here. So this is for sprinklers and specifically, doesn't really matter what type of sprinklers, but we really want to ensure we have a few things, okay? The first component that we want to make sure we have is the flow rate. We need them to be the same, right? So if you can imagine all these sprinklers out in the field, you want every sprinkler to have the same flow rate. Pivots are slightly different, and I'll explain that here as we go, but ultimately, you have linear moves, you have, you know, if you have different end guns out there, right, you want the flow rate from all of those machines to be identical or as close as possible. And so we refer to this as the GPM DU, okay? And so that GPM DU is something that we can measure out there in the field. And here are the factors then that affect that GPM DU, right? Of course, if you understand basic hydraulics a little bit, you know, friction as water flows through a pipeline that consumes some energy, that basically reduces the pressure. So if you have a big gun that's close to a pump and a big gun that's much further away from the pump, most likely that one that's much further away is going to have lower pressure because of the friction, the energy it takes to get that water all the way to that machine. So, you know, we've got to pay attention to that. Also, having different nozzle sizes, right? If you have sprinklers out there and they have different nozzle sizes, they're going to put out different amounts of water. And then wear on those nozzles, and then also obviously plugging, okay, is a big issue. Now you can spot plugging pretty easily on especially on pivots, but it's a little harder to spot wear, right? Because wear means the hole gets a little bit bigger, and when that hole gets a little bit bigger, a little bit more water comes through it than normally would. So that's GPM DU. So that's one of the components. The next component is catch can DU. I usually call it here, or CCDU. This is how uniformly the water is being thrown through the air from the sprinkler and then ultimately landing on the ground. So you have to start first with good GPM DU, because if you don't have the same flows coming out of those sprinklers, then as the water flies through the air, you know, one sprinkler is putting out more water than another, they're not going to land on the ground uniformly. So you really need to start with the GPM DU, because the GPM DU ultimately kind of affects the catch can DU. The biggest thing that affects the catch can DU is the spacing, right? And this is really a key on the big guns, is how far apart do you guys put those lanes that you pull those big guns down, right? Especially when I'm talking about with travelers now. So the spacing is a big factor. Okay. Of course, the sprinkler design and trajectory, you can get different angles at which the water shoots out, right? A lot of times they're between 20 and 25 degrees or so of angle. And so, and of course, the height of the cart affects it with big guns. The height of the sprinkler on a pivot affects, how much water or overlap you're getting. So you need to kind of make sure that you don't have different sprinkler types out there either, meaning different angles and whatnot. Okay. Of course, the nozzle size and pressure, we already talked about that. We were talking about that has to be good at GPMDU. And then wind. This is the big one, right? This is the one right here that we cannot control. We can't do anything about it. We can do a lot about the other things, right? About the spacing, about the design of the sprinkler, about making sure they're all the same, ensuring the pressures are good. But when it comes to wind, we have no control over that. Right. In some areas, I think actually like New Zealand, they will plant tree rows along edges of fields, and like almost every field is lined with tree rows in certain areas, and they're trying to protect against the wind, trying to get that wind up and over the tree line, out of the path of the sprinklers, right? So wind is obviously a problem there. And then plant interference. This isn't really a problem too much. Maybe with pivots, depending on what crop you're growing. For example, up in Washington, they grow a lot of corn under pivots. Also in the Midwest, in the states here. And when that corn starts to get tall, if your sprinklers aren't above that, well, then you're not getting overlap either, right? And so catch can uniformity, really another way or another thing we're talking about here is overlap, right? How well are the sprinklers overlapping each other? Okay. Then you have two other factors here: unequal drainage during startup and shutdown, and edge effect. Edge effect, right, is at the edge of a field where you're not getting any overlap because you're at the edge. So on a pivot, the edge of the field isn't getting quite as much overlap as the center of a span, right? And especially if the wind's blowing, that's going to affect the edge of the machine. It's usually pretty minor, but it is something to be, aware of. For example, on that one, on pivots, you probably, if your wind blows, here in California, the wind typically will pick up in the afternoon, right? And I don't know, probably the same there, but it probably starts to blow at a certain time nearly every day. And so what we'll recommend on that is to fix the edge effect is don't run your machine on like a 24 or 48 hour turn. Because if you run it on a 24-hour turn and let's just say at noon every day, the wind picks up, that means you're basically always in the exact same spot in the field when the wind picks up. And so as that machine goes around, when you're there, you're getting non-uniformity because of the wind, and it's always happening at the exact same spot in the field since you are on a 24-hour turn. So that one of the easiest ways to fix that problem is to put it on some odd number, put it on a 26-hour turn or something, or something that's not divisible by 24. That way you're always in a slightly different spot in the field when the wind picks up, and you're spreading out the non-uniformity, which makes it uniform, if you can believe that, right? And so that's kind of the idea on that. And then the unequal drainage is just turning it on and turning it off, right? When you turn on a big gun at first, there's not a whole lot of pressure. As it builds up pressure, it's shooting out water, right there locally. And so that spot's getting more water than it would if it was when it was under pressure sliding down the lane. Okay. And so those are the four main factors. Okay. And by the way, these things that I'm talking about here are good for hand move sprinklers. If any of you are doing that, they're good for solid set sprinklers. If you're doing that, I mean, the concepts are all the same, right? We want the same flow rate out of every single one of these sprinklers. We want good overlap between these sprinklers. Okay. It's good for big guns. All right. Nelson Irrigation obviously is one of the manufacturers of a lot of the big guns. And so I've got a lot of information from Nelson in here. It's good for the travelers, right? In this particular case, you'd set up the buckets and let the machine walk across the traveler, or let the traveler move the sprinkler across the buckets and collect how much water is in there. Okay. It's good for wheel lines and side rolls. I'm not sure if you guys have those up there or not. I've never been up that way, but it's good for linear moves, right? Those concepts that we were talking about, GPMDU, catch can DU, edge effect, and unequal drainage. right, are good for all these different systems. It's good for boom reels. These are becoming a little bit more common here in California. They're still very uncommon, but they're catching a little bit of I guess a little bit of popularity because you have a lot more sprinklers there that are applying the water rather than one big gun shooting the water out and the wind being able to blow it around, right? You have now multiple little sprinklers, and so they're becoming a little more popular here. And they're even good for balloon irrigation. You guys ever seen this? It's supposed to play a video here. Of course, there it goes. So this is high-end stuff right here, guys. Yeah, you need to make sure. I've never seen this in my life. It's on YouTube. But you know what? The process would still work. We could use our program there with our 4 components and determine how uniform the water is being applied there. So yeah, it would work on that too. But I mentioned earlier that pivots are a little bit different. Okay, why are pivots a little bit different? If you could think about it, if you want to put it in the chat too, you can go ahead. But the answer is because as a pivot goes around in a circle, right? This sprinkler out here, as an example, is responsible for a much, much bigger area than a sprinkler that's way back in here, right? It covers a much bigger circumference as it goes around. And so for that reason, the flow rate here has to be quite a bit higher here compared to one of the sprinklers over here. So the idea of doing a GPM DU, making sure all those sprinklers are at the same flow rate is not right on a pivot, right? On a linear move, on big guns, on solid set, on side roll, on all those other ones, that's what you want. But on a pivot, it's a little different because of the way it actually operates. So I'm going to go through the evaluation of a pivot and show you how to do this, okay? Just in case you ever want to test your machine. So pivots are different, but the concepts are still there. We need to make sure that we're getting the right amount of water out of the sprinklers and we're getting good overlap, okay? LIPA is also a little bit different. I don't know if you guys do any LIPA, low energy precision application up in your area, but this is where you're basically trying to apply the water right where the plant needs it. And so these are a little bit different too, because, now we're talking, you're not catch can DU, the idea of the water flying through the air and overlapping, there is none, right? And so the big factor here becomes making sure that the flow rates out of those sprinklers is exactly what it needs to be in order to apply the correct amount of water to those plants, right? So there's the 4 concepts. Your traditional sprinklers that have overlap, water flying through the air, you hit the 4 concepts. But if you're using a pivot or if you're using something like LIPA, then you really focus on certain components of those four components, right? In this case, you'd be focused on the GPM DU being very high. So that way you're getting the right amount of water. All right, so we've done a lot of evaluations of pivots over the years, and this is just a little summation of those. And what I want to point out here are the things that affect non-uniformity, meaning this is why it's not perfect. Okay, and you'll notice I've kind of color coordinated them, green being things that involve the catch can DU and red being things that involve the GPM DU. And so you'll see there the green things are overlap. Again, how far apart are the lanes for the big guns, right? How far apart are the sprinklers on a pivot? Are they 10 feet apart or are they 5 feet apart? Okay, those things affect the overlap or the catch can DU. And then a non-rotating sprinkler, of course, affects that too, because if it's not rotating, it's just always shooting in one direction. Well, then you're not getting any overlap except for in the direction it's shooting. That tends to be a small problem, but I've evaluated probably over 100 pivots in my career so far, and you find non-rotating sprinklers out there. They just get gummed up, they get sand in them from the wind blowing or whatever, and they will stop spinning. So sometimes it's just a matter of getting it to spin again. Other times it just needs to be replaced. And then if you look there at the other ones, pressure differences, always going to have pressure differences. Again, because as water flows, you have friction. When there's friction, it's consuming some of your energy. And so they're just not going to be the same in different spots. Now, we can't put pressure regulation to try to mitigate some of that, but then you have to have more pressure at the pump, which means more operating costs and so on. Mixed nozzles, again, on pivots, by the way, the nozzle size is what gets you the different flow rates. So as you move from the center of the pivot towards the outer edge of the pivot, the nozzle size gradually increases. There's a deal called a pivot package that all the pivot manufacturers will supply you when you purchase a machine, or if you request a new pivot package, they will tell you exactly what you need where. The problem is that they get plugged up, they get worn out, they get, and people start taking them apart to clean them and fix them. And then all of a sudden they start getting mixed up, right? And so once they start getting mixed up, that's a problem, right? On big guns, you have a 7/8 inch nozzle or something in there, right? And one of them might have a 1 inch for whatever reason, so you just got to make sure that things are standardized out there. And that's kind of the key. Then sand wear and plug nozzles. So if you look at all of the reasons that you have non-uniformity, 60% of it is because of CCDU, catch can DU, and whatever that adds up to be there is GPM DU. So in total, 98% of the problem here, or 92%, 92% of the problem is because of one of those two factors, catch can DU or GPM DU. So that means the edge effect, yeah, it is a problem, but it's pretty minimal. And then the startup and shutdown is also pretty minimal, especially if you run for long irrigation sets. Okay. So we need to focus then on these two things, making sure our flow rates are what they need to be, whether they're exactly the same, like on a linear move, or whether they're the right flow rate for the distance from the center point. And then you also need to focus on making sure you have good overlap. Okay. So again, if you have any questions, maybe I'm just killing it here, and so you don't have any questions yet, but if you have any questions, feel free to ask, all right? So the major ones, I've kind of hit this already, the catch can DU, the overlap, right? And the big one here for the pivots is the drop distance, right? How far apart are the drops on the machine? And so if they're really tight and you have lots and lots of overlap, you're probably going to have a high catch can DU. And then on the big guns, the lane distance or the lane spacing is really the big one. Okay. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures of that here in just a moment. And then of course, the bottom line is on all of this, the wind is a factor, right? One day it's windy and the next day it's not. And, and so that plays a big role, and we can't really control that. And then for your GPM DU, we talked about the pressure variations and the plugging. So those are the two major factors that affect it. And so those are what we need to be looking for when we're trying to figure out if we're applying the water uniformly or not to a field. Okay, so here's an example of a modern day pivot. This was, I think, for potatoes. And you notice they have drops everywhere. They have drops forward, backward, down the center, right? And the concept on this is that a potato, of course, has a very shallow root zone. And so they want a big, big wetted area, and they want to apply a shallow depth of water to keep those potatoes happy. And of course, the size of the potato is really dependent on the distribution uniformity. If the DU is not very good, you're going to have small potatoes in some areas of the field and large potatoes in other areas of the field. And so since we want to have really uniform potato growth, right, we want to have really high distribution uniformity. And so they're achieving this by getting tons of overlap and then making sure that the flow rates out of each of those sprinklers is where they want it to be. And then that also helps with the instantaneous application rate is a little bit lower too. So you're not pushing water down below your root zone as this machine walks over the field. Okay. Now compare that to big guns out here, right? How much overlap do we have here on this particular? Here I don't have it with it running. I could show you a picture with it running, but you're going to have sprinklers overlapping sprinklers. Like one sprinkler is going to be throwing, this sprinkler here, for example, is probably throwing 3 or 4 sprinklers over. So you have tons of overlap. But here, how much overlap do we have? Right? Look at the shot of this. It looks like this one's maybe going to throw water to there, and that one's probably going to throw water back. So do we even have overlap in this case? There's no overlap here, right? And so this is going to be a problem because we're not going to have that catch can DU is not going to be as high as it could be. And so I want to just walk you through that a little bit here. So just looking at like a Nelson big gun, right? Here's kind of one in action real quickly. you know, this is just how it works here. I had to do my classes virtual, you know, the last year. And so I had to record a bunch of video. And so this is just one of the videos there, but you can kind of see how the big gun works. You know, it chunks over quite a bit every time the arm hits it, right? And so it's not super smooth. And then you have the wind blowing and so on. So that's a little bit of a problem there. Okay. So you put big guns on the end of a pivot too, right? To gain a little bit more ground. Now, how much overlap are you going to get on an end gun on a pivot? Zero, right? And so you have to kind of look at the sprinkler profile. Here's another one. You know, single lane, just a single pass. And so you're really relying on the machine to do a job that it can't really do without overlap. And so this is what Nelson, you know, with their perfect environment indoors with the right pressures and everything else, this is the kind of pattern that they can achieve. And it's really a pretty good pattern, right? I mean, it's almost flat, meaning the further distance you go, right? Between 50 and 100 feet, it's almost applying the exact same depth there the whole way. It applies a little bit more closer and it applies, of course, less as you move out. So it's a good pattern, but you put it out in the real conditions with the wind and so forth, right? And by the way, that's what the, I guess the histogram would look like on a single machine or a single big gun just going around, right? You've got not a, you know, notice the color coding here. So red means you're applying more water, and that's what you saw on this, right? There's a zone in here where you're applying more water, and then it kind of flattens out and then it dies off, right? And that's what you're seeing there. So that's not really the best overlap uniformity. This is an example of one that I've evaluated, a big gun. And you can see here that the, you know, the way it drops off there is a little different than how they show it. And this is probably because of wind and the height of the big gun and so on and so forth. All that affects it. So you look at that, then you compare this. That's basically what they're doing, right? They're getting out to a certain distance and then they're not really getting any water. They're hoping to get that distance, but because of the pressures they're at, the wind, all this other stuff, it's not really getting the distance that they're looking for there. And so you can see those are really just coming together and you got a spot there that's not getting a whole lot of water. So this is simulated. I just took the sprinkler profile, the one I was showing you just a minute ago, and then I simulated what it would be if you actually use the distance that they spec for this particular sprinkler here, 140 feet, 144 feet. You'll notice that really you don't have any overlap except for a little bit of overlap that's kind of happening in this area right here. And so when you combine these two, here's the depth of water that gets applied to the field, right? Near the sprinklers, near the big guns, you're getting pretty good depth applied, but out here between the sprinklers, you know, you're getting 100. This is just milliliters, just volumes in buckets compared to 175 or so. So you're getting whatever that is, 75% more water near the sprinklers compared to the center. So what if you were to not overlap them so far? What if you were to actually say, okay, the gun's shooting 84 feet, so let's only make the lane spacing 84 feet. This is what the profiles would look like now, overlapped. And this is what they would look like when they come together. How does that look? Way better, right? Now I mean, that looks beautiful. It doesn't really get a whole lot better than that. And so that's what we're after here when we do the overlap. And so Nelson has one. Here's what it looks like, their histogram whenever they do the overlap of 4 of them now. You can see that there are still kind of hot spots and cool spots, but for the most part, it's kind of this pinkish red color, right? And so the overlap ends up being better. Okay. One simple solution that you can do for travelers is that you can actually do what's called alternate sets. This idea has been around for a long time. That's a really old slide. I'm just showing you that because it's been around for a long time. So this might be your lanes that you're going to put the sprinklers down or the traveler down when you're going through the field the first time. And then the second time, maybe just go to the center of those lanes. So your spacing is still the same at whatever spacing you're at, but now you're offsetting it by 50%, which means that now as you go through the first time and then you come back through the second time, that's going to now improve your distribution uniformity because now you're kind of wetting, you're putting the wet spot now where the dry spot was, if that makes sense. So, you know, here's a couple of them out there in the field, right? Big pressures. When you shoot the water like that, the wind has a pretty good impact on it. And so what I'm saying is that here's a lane here, right? Here's a lane here. So maybe the next time you come through, you actually put a lane, you know, in between those two. That might be an option to help with this. Of course, you need booster pumps to get the pressure that you need. You know, sometimes they're, you know, they can be PTO driven. They can be, you know, like this, whatever. You guys know this. Here's a boom. I think you saw this one already. I kind of showed it to you, but here's what it looks like in action. It's basically the same reel mechanism, right? But now it's just connected to a cart with booms on it. This is a really good improvement over big guns. So those of you that are looking to maybe do a little bit of investment, this would probably be a good investment. Okay. So, all right. So pivots are a little bit different. I realized I'm already running out of time here. So let me go through this. Here's early version of a pivot, right? It's called the Tri-Matic. It was amazing. It wasn't really, but concept was there. Then, of course, we got into the bigger machines where you would try to, you know, these were water powered where it actually drive the wheels. There's kind of one that's still out there, still being used, but looks a little bit more like the modern ones. And then, of course, here's what your modern one looks like. Now, remember, on a pivot, we were saying, hey, you have to have a good distribution uniformity. And it's hard to really determine that because, see, the flow rates are different, right, as we go down the machine. And so the way we have to do this then is we have to basically evaluate the entire machine at once. So you put buckets out the entire length of the machine and you run the water over the buckets, right? And in theory, if everything was perfect, every bucket would have the same amount of water. They don't, but they're close, right? But remember, this bucket here is a lot more important than this bucket here. Why? Because this bucket represents a much larger percentage of the field compared to that bucket. And so when we do the evaluation, we have to weight it to know, you know, this, knowing that this bucket is more important. So we weight it based on distance from the center point. Okay. So, you know, I talked a lot about this already. So I'm going to kind of skip it since I'm running behind, but the concepts are all going to be laid out here, right? So you evaluate a representative center pivot. So if you have multiple pivots, if they're all basically the same design, you only really need to test one of them, assuming that they're all being run the same, right? Set the buckets up on an even spacing, hopefully not the same spacing as the sprinklers. So if the sprinklers are on a 9-foot spacing, you want to probably do like a, you know, a 14-foot spacing or something like that, just to get a different, so you don't get any anomalies. So I set up, this is just an evaluation. I set up a bunch of sprinklers out there, or a bunch of buckets. I mean, I ran the pivot over it. Here's the non-weighted values in milliliters. So how much water we collected in the buckets. Remember, if everything was perfect, all those dots would be in a nice straight line and be perfect. I did my evaluation of it using the average of the low quarter divided by the average of all after weighting it. And we got an actual distribution uniformity here of 0.73. Not terrible, but the design is 0.9. So it's kind of missing the mark, right? And so I just want to go through here what we did. So the first thing we did was we raised the sprinklers up a little bit. They're a little low. So when they're closer to the ground, you're not getting as much overlap. You bring them up, they get more overlap. And then we also staggered them here. So that way the streams don't collide with each other, which disrupts the overlap pattern. Here's an example of, you know, this was sorghum, and you can't even really see the sprinklers. They're all down here in the crop. So how much overlap we're going to be getting there, right? None. So any case, stagger them to prevent the colliding of the water, right? Make them look good. Then we also, any tilted sprinklers, because of the weight that's hanging on them, we got rid of all of the tilted sprinklers. Here's a really bad tilted sprinkler. You don't want these for certain. Okay. I got jokes. I can't even tell if they're a hit though, you know, because anyways. So then we removed all the debris that was coming through the filters and coming onto the nozzles. You know, once you get water on the plate here, right, that water can't hit this point of the plate anymore. And so you don't get those streams anymore, which means you're not getting good overlap, right? So you clean up all the sprinklers out there. Fix anything that was broken. We had a couple sprinkler bodies that were broken and whipping around. We replaced the nozzles to make sure they're all the right size. They're color coordinated and numbered, so you can quickly go through and make sure they're all right. And then we ran an evaluation again. So I have the new evaluation, the red line, overlaid with the old evaluation, the blue line. Notice what happened to the to the points there. They got a lot tighter. Still not perfect, but they got a lot tighter. And now our distribution uniformity, but with those improvements, is a 0.89, which is basically right where we want to be, right? I mean, the design was 0.9. So with wind and everything else that we had going, I would say that's ideal now. One of the reasons this is very important, those of you that are injecting fertilizers, right? If you're injecting fertilizers into your pivot, it's only going out as uniformly as the water. So you could be over fertilizing in some areas and under fertilizing in other areas. So you have to make sure your distribution uniformity is high. And if you're using soil sensors, right? This is an example of using a soil sensor. You pick a spot in the field to put your soil sensors. How do you know it's right? You don't. But if we had a DU of 0.73, looking at plus or minus 10% of the average here, basically that means about 36% chance that our soil sensor is in the right spot to represent an average. And if you went to a 0.89, it gives us a 71% chance that we have plus or minus 10% of average. So that means, you know, having a high distribution uniformity is very important. Okay. We want to worry about DU because it increases water use efficiency, minimizes depercolation, makes scheduling simpler, makes representative locations in your field for sampling of plants, for sampling or for soil sensors, for whatever it is you're doing better. And then it also improves that reliability again on our soil sensors. Hugh, do I have a few more minutes for some interesting photos, or should we call it? We're good? All right, here's some interesting photos. I just threw these in there because when you do this stuff, you run into fun stuff. Maybe you guys have some interesting photos on your own farms, but here's the first one here. Maybe takes a minute to see what it is, but this is your wheel track for your center pivot going over your electrical equipment here, getting it all wet, noticing that it's rusting up there. And then on top of that, you know, they have their chemical tank not in the basin in case it breaks, you know, to collect it. It's just going to go out on the ground. So just some details, you know, that you need to pay attention to. Here's one where they take a linear move over a canal. So they got bridges basically where the linear move will literally walk from one field over into the other field across bridges. Wheel tracks, you know, become a problem. So keeping them dry is kind of an important thing. When my picture reformatted there, but you would see roller coaster ride over here on this side, you know, basically is what it was. And so if you can keep them dry, that's a good thing, so that your pivot's not doing extra work out there. You know, there's an example of a rut going into a bridge, you know, just that can be problematic. Some people have really good ideas on how to keep their wheel tracks dry, man. You just put some shield over it, right? Call it good. Yeah, sure. No idea what they're thinking on that one, but I guess it helps. You got, you know, holes in the ground here. That's usually a sign that a sprinkler's broken and the water pressure is just shooting right into the ground. We call that direct injection, right? No overlap at all. It's not really good either. This is how you make a whole lot of snow. I bet you guys do a lot of this up there, right? This is actually wastewater. And so we're taking water that people flush down the toilet and we're irrigating with it. We had nothing else we could do with it. So we happened to get snow in this particular area and we had to keep irrigating. And so we were making lots of yellow snow. It was good. It actually was such a problem that we had like 50 pounds hanging off of all the drops, and it ended up pulling down our pivots to the ground because of all the weight from the ice. So that's a problem. Oh, and this one's my favorite here. They decided to put some pivots out in the desert to reuse wastewater again. And nobody decided to say, hey, you know what? I think that pole might be in the way of the pivot going around. And so turns out they maiden voyage going around to hit the pole and flip the machine over. In fact, the tires hit the pole and it hit that little nail and it just crawled up the pole until it literally flipped itself over and made it land like it did. So didn't even run water through it yet. It's really good. But look, it's desert with one pole out there. Come on, guys. All right. My last slide here is if you pull out your cell phone, I got some QR codes here. The first QR code there on the left is for the ITRC website. This is where you can find information about classes we teach and resources that we have available online. And then the QR code on the right is what we call our Irrigation Consumer Bill of Rights. We have a couple of them, but what this basically tells you is when you go to purchase a machine or a, whatever irrigation system, I know a lot of you are probably switching to drip. It tells you, hey, here's the stuff that you need to pay attention to, right? Here's what you need to look for. Here's the questions that you need to ask the dealer when you're buying this stuff. Because you probably don't know what questions to ask. You're like, yeah, I want a drip system, but I don't know what that means. And so that Irrigation Consumer Bill of Rights will help you ask questions to get you exactly what you're looking for. So you should be able to scan both those QR codes and pull those up and get what you need out of that. Okay. So that's all I had for today. Appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, feel free. You can find my information there on the ITRC webpage, and you can ask any questions you have. Okay.
So we do have a question. So on a traveling gun, should it be set to 180 degrees for optimum DU?
So that's a really great question. And I don't know, William, do you have any? California, we don't have a whole lot of traveling guns. I've evaluated some, but that's I would say reach out to the gun manufacturer, Nelson, for example. They would probably be able to give you a much better idea. I've read 170 a lot for some reason, but I don't know why. So William, maybe you can answer that one.
Not really. Just depends on how good the wind's blowing.
Yeah, sure.
That's pretty much it.
Sure.
I'm not sure though.
Yeah, so sorry, Richard, I'm not able to answer that directly. There's a lot of factors that affect that, and so yeah, talk to Nelson if you're thinking about what angle you should have and so forth, and yeah. So sorry, that was a lousy answer.
No, that's okay. Perfect.
Yeah, so we only have one question, I think, right?
Yeah, but there's still time, so you can still put your questions in the question box as we continue on.
Yes, so we are going to have William sharing with us about his experiments in managing irrigation system, and then he's well prepared. So he recorded a video, so I'm going to play the video to everybody. Let me share my screen. Let me know if this doesn't go well, Karen, because last one was kind of embarrassing.
I'll let you know.
Okay, so. Is that okay?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good.
I run the news.
Okay, I'm going to.
Hi, thanks for having me. I run the Unequal Spurr. I run the field irrigation on our farm at Spurr Brothers. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the operation has changed a little bit over the years, about moisture readers, and then talk about the different irrigation systems: center pivot, gun, and boom. I'll take a very basic approach. If anybody has any specific questions about any system, I'm more than willing to go into greater detail. I'll start with some pictures from our family farm this year. I say 2020 wasn't a fun year, and the lack of rain did not help this. I think we got rain twice all season. We irrigate, we have a lot of different irrigation systems. So all the smaller stuff is usually on trickle tape. So garlic, tree nursery, sweet corn. That's the first time we've ever irrigated sweet corn before. Hopefully we don't have to do that again. Orchard, apples, pears, peaches, solid trickle lines on that. And then field crop, which I'm going to be getting into, is onions, carrots, potatoes. We use gun, center pivot, and boom irrigation. All of these pictures are from our Facebook page. I didn't have, I couldn't find any of the boom or the pivot, but there will be some pictures later on in the presentation. We do farm on some very sandy soils, therefore irrigation is vital to our operation. Potatoes especially is for early market, and so it's the soil is very sandy. So it depends on a lot of things: the crop, stage of crop, soil type, weather. They all play a major role into irrigation, but so does irrigation systems, which I'm going to get into. But first, we'll talk about before, what we used to do. Here's a picture of my dad, my grandfather, and my uncle. When my dad and uncle ran the irrigation, it was quite different. Our farm didn't really need a full-time irrigation crew. We would use the harvesting crew or the packing crew to get it done. And this worked. We didn't start irrigating early. Most of the time irrigation was used to bulk up the potatoes, and it was done in July and August. Now it is done a lot earlier and a lot more often. So it became necessary to irrigate earlier in the season. When I took over irrigation on the farm, I asked Sonny Murray, when should I irrigate? He told me when the planter pulls out of the field, set up your irrigation. It took a few years for that to sink in, but that is what I do now. It has paid off, especially last year. Just making me be proactive, not trying to play catch up is very beneficial for the crop and for my sanity. That is why moisture meters are very important. The soil the last few years especially has dried out quicker in the spring. This year I irrigated in May for the first time ever. First time ever this farm has irrigated in May. It was the last day of May, but it was still May. Irrigating more often. So this picture, brother, myself, sister, father on a much needed rainy day, but we don't get enough of these. So we have to irrigate pretty often. Last summer, there was one section of a potato field that I irrigated, and then 3 days later, I had it irrigated again. The moisture reader went from 6 dots to 1 dot in those 3 days. I don't know what the actual dots mean. You can kind of see the numbers there, but 1 dot means that your plant's going to die soon if you don't get water on it. It was extremely hot. Those 3 days, the nights were just as hot. The wind was blowing like crazy. The potatoes were bulking. So it made sense that it dried out that quickly. But I still couldn't believe it. I was about to move the irrigation reel to the next field, but when I saw that 1 dot, I had to keep it there. If I didn't have this type of moisture reader, I would have just carried on to the next field. The old style moisture readers are good, but you have to make a point to check them. It would not have occurred to me to check the moisture reader. Probably would have done it in a few days, and by then it could have been too late. So then I'll move on to managing irrigation. So when I think of managing irrigation, this is what I think of. Top left is pipe that came apart. The hole's probably deep enough to fit a lighthouse in. Top middle is a hose run over by a car. They had to get to their favorite fishing hole. Top right, bell from the pipe slid right off. Most of our pipe is welded onto the bell, but this one obviously wasn't, or the chance it just broke from the pressure. Bottom left, that cloud of water is just from one O-ring missing. So that's never fun. It takes a lot of time to fix that, let the water all drain out. The middle bottom picture there is an operational box from the pump. That box is off and the pressure gauge is reading 30 PSI. So that had to be changed. And then the last picture is just a gasket worn out at the gun. And then let's get into irrigation systems. So center pivot, gun, and boom is what I'll be talking about now. All of them have advantages and disadvantages. Size and shape of field, plays a big role in this. These are all from our fields. Center pivot, ideally are used in a circular field that covers large acreage, but we use ours in an L-shaped field. It works great. The pivot doesn't go in a complete circle. Normally, ideally, it would. And I think technically ours is called a mini pivot because we can move it too. The middle field, odd shaped field. So gun irrigation works great in that. And then the field on the right there is great for boom irrigation. Straight, long, it'd be too small to think about a pivot. So the irrigation system to manage, if I could choose, would be a center pivot. But that also means that, it's a big chunk of land that you have growing crops that need water every year almost. The best thing is you can run it during the day. Wind, sun won't affect it too much. which means the leaves are not wet, which is great for reducing the risk of diseases. It is very water efficient, uses a lot less water to get a good coverage, but it is a large investment, big startup costs, big labor costs at the beginning. But once it's in place, it is so simple to operate, easy to use, consistent, has different emitters throughout each section, so it puts out the same amount of water. You still need the same equipment, pump, filter, pipe. The only additional gear you need is usually a source of power to move the pivot. So ours is set up with a generator. The only issue with these are when something goes wrong, it's usually a major problem. So I said before we can move ours. So there's 2 red dots there in the field, and that's where we have 2 spots we can move it to. One spot covers about 45 acreage, so it doesn't have to be, 100-acre field that you're dealing with. 45 acres is great to have one thing that covers that area. I can choose how fast it moves. That means I can choose how much water it's getting at. Like choose if the onions are only a couple inches tall, then I can put a ½ inch. I don't need to put an inch on then, and it's just really simple to do. The 2 right pictures are us moving it, so you can't do it during the growing season. It just has to be moved and just is moved when we decide what crop is going to go in those fields. There is quite a few of these systems in Nova Scotia, but like our farm, the average field is probably 15 acres, so it's not as common as the others. Boom system is great to have, is kind of the best of both worlds with a pivot and a gun. It is mobile as long as you have a good operator. If you have enough acreage in one spot, then it's not too bad at all, because moving it in the field isn't that big of a problem, just on the road. It takes a long time before I'm comfortable or workers are comfortable moving this on the road. They're big, the wings stick out pretty far on each side. It does take, in the field, it does take longer to set up. Have to unfold the booms, line everything up just right. Less room for error than a gun irrigation. Wind and sun don't affect it too much, but field shape does. We flipped our boom once because of the shape of the field. We didn't want to bring a different reel with a gun on to do one section of the field, so we tried to make it work, but got a little too close to the ditch. It is very efficient. It uses less water than a gun, and it is really consistent. And gun irrigation. It's the most common, takes the most time as well. It has some advantages. You can move it easily from one field to the next. Size and shape of the field does not matter too much. Less initial investment than a pivot, but more labor intensive. It has its cons. You lose a lot of water to evaporation and wind during the day, and when irrigating at night, the leaves just stay wet for a long time and attracted to diseases. Like a lot of things in farming though, labor and operators play a huge role. It took quite a few years to train Jamaicans, so until I was comfortable sending them off to do fields to irrigate, but it did save me last year. Irrigation isn't too hard, but like most things, it's in the detail, making sure the O-rings in each pipe, making sure the right valves are open, lining the reel up straight, which you wouldn't think would be too hard, but it does. It is for some people get the hang of. You can see the picture there, the blue reel is from them not lining it up straight, and it just, we had to cut, I think, a piece of that hose off to make it straight again. When I first took over irrigation, I was there from the beginning to end, put the pump in place, picked up the pipe, laid out the pipe. Then I would put the reel in place, pull it out, go to the next field, do the exact same thing. If it wasn't too windy, by the end, I would start the reels heading back to the farm. Then in the evening, I would check them, make sure the timing's right, make sure that the timer on the pump would be right with the reel coming in. And then in the morning, I would check the reels to make sure everything was good to go and do it all over again the next day. So I decided we needed to start training some people because we were irrigating more often and needed a crew. So I grabbed a few Jamaicans and started training them. So this took quite a few years. And that's why I grabbed a couple Jamaicans, because I knew that it was guys that we've had for, I want to say 10 years already on the farm. I knew they were coming back. And we had to have a full-time irrigation crew. So the first year of training, I put the pump in place. They would look after the pipe and they would help me line up the gun, but I would still pull it out into the field. Year 2, I would put the pump in place and then I would drop the reel off in the field, not set up, not lined up. They would do all that. They would set it up. They would set up all the pipe, line up the reel, pull it out. Next day, they would move it to the next spot in the field, and they were fine to move it in the field, but not yet from field to field, which I would still do. Year 3, one of the guys was confident in moving the reels from field to field, and so they would pretty much set everything up. The only thing I would do would be I'd move the reel if it was going a long distance, and I would still help them with the boom. They would move the boom in the field, but they wouldn't move the boom on the road. And then this summer will be year 4. I'm hoping that the guy that was comfortable moving the reel on the road will now move the pump in place. Mostly I did the pump because I had to fuel it up or pull it out to fuel up. So I wanted to make sure that it was in the right spot and easy access to do that. And then this year, I'm hoping that I can get them started to start the irrigation. And that's it for me. If anyone has any questions, I'll be willing to take them.
That's great. So thank you, William, sharing his experiments in managing irrigation system in their farms. So we can take any questions if anybody has any comments or questions. Do we see anything here, Karen?
No, not yet, but feel free to pop them in the question box or the chat there. But in the meantime, I have a couple of questions. So Dr. Gaudi, do you have any, I'm looking at the low energy precision application thing. Do you have any data on volume of water used on that type of a system versus a more traditional linear move or pivot system?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a management thing, right? And so you can find, I guess I'm gonna not really directly answer your question, because the problem is this is a big misconception too by switching to drip. You switch to drip and people say, oh, we save 50% of the water, right? And then you look at the data and you go, well, it's probably because you didn't understand how to irrigate with the sprinklers, right? Because in the end, the plant really needs the same amount of water. It doesn't care how it gets the water. And so are you really saving water or not, right? And so the bottom line is that it depends on how it was being managed in both cases. And so you could find data that would show you that, yeah, you can save water by switching to LIPA. Or you can find, data that says it doesn't really save you a whole lot. But what you can find very consistently is that low energy means that the pumping cost is much lower. Since you're basically just laying the water onto the ground, you can do that at less than 10 PSI. Whereas with the sprinklers, you're usually in the 30 PSI range or something like that. And so, so you're saving energy in terms of pumping costs and maybe the amount of water, assuming that they were doing the right thing with both. Both overhead sprinklers pressurized and then LIPA with low pressure, the water consumption might actually be very similar, but the power is kind of where you're getting some savings for sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And as a follow-up to that, do you notice any disease issues, like moving disease through a field by kind of dragging it through the crop like that?
Yeah, so Texas is where we have a lot of the LIPA systems, and they're very aware of that. Yeah, because those socks, for example, can just spread it. And so if that might be a case, then they might go to bubblers, which just kind of let the water fall onto the ground from maybe a foot or a foot and a half.
Right.
But I guess one of the big keys on that is is like, for example, with tomatoes, you don't really want to get the bed of the bed wet because you have tomatoes sitting on there, they'll rot. And so by having that sock actually put the water down into the furrow between the tomato rows without getting the bed wet is one big advantage of that. Now, most people just switch to drip, subsurface drip with tomatoes for that reason. But yeah, there are advantages. And of course, there are disadvantages like you just listed of those methods. So you have to definitely keep all that in consideration when you choose to do an option like that.
Great, thank you. Question for William. Do you move the reels with water in them when traveling on the road? They're quite heavy when they're full of water.
No, we blow ours all out. If it is a short distance, we'll do it, but we try to blow them out, and most of the time we end up blowing them out. But a lot of times we don't need to put them on the road too often. It's usually we have a reel that's in one spot for most of the summer.
Mm-hmm. And my question for you, William, is have you ever done a bucket test, like set the buckets out and measured them?
I've put out gauges in different sections to see what I'm dealing with, and just to make sure that what I have it set at will give me that like 3/4 of an inch every once in a while, just to make sure. But no, I've never done the buckets before.
Well, I guess sensors would be doing a similar thing anyways, so. Yeah, nope, that's great.
Can I add to that? Sensors would if you had a lot of sensors, but if you only have one sensor, then you're only getting the spot that you're getting, right? And so I'm not anti-sensor, but you have to understand that sensors, when he was talking about that one sensor in that one spot, it measures tension, by the way. So it's looking at how much water there is. More water is less tension. And so as you get more and more tension, you're getting, that's when you get to your one dot there. But that's for that spot. And if he was to have another one of those sensors in another spot, it might not have said it was as bad as that spot was, right? And so multiple sensors is a good idea, but of course they cost money, right? And so you want 1,000 sensors out there, but that's a lot of money. So
yeah,
bucket test is a one-time thing, but in theory it should repeat, right? If the wind conditions are similar and everything else, it should repeat. And so getting an evaluation done is helpful on those.
And I'll usually have like 2 rain gauges under my pivot
as well. Okay, so that's kind of like a bucket, right?
Yeah, so it's that's what I meant by not sensors, but the rain gauges is usually what I'll have out in the field, and I'll do that every once in a while. And I'll do that with a gun too once in a while, just to see what I'm getting.
Very good.
Yep. It's good to hear Dr. Gaudi's presentation and then go to William's. Actually, helps me to understand more in the real practical life how the irrigation system can be used in the farm scale. So it's good to have both of you talk about this topic. Yeah. No, it's awesome, Dr. Gaudi. We'd like to be back again.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm good. We can hold on after I have 2 more slides to go, but yeah, I have 2 more slides to go. Kaden, can you help me to see if the screen is in the full screen? Just a second. Very bad on this. Is that full screen now?
It's on your whole PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Here. There we go. Okay,
yep, there you go. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. I have 3 screens going on. It's confusing. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the CU credit point is available for people who has CCA, CPAG, and CPSS, and the CPSC only. So if you don't have a CCA app, you can send your name, your contact information, and your certificate number to myself. My email address is here. But if you do have a CCA app, you can just scan this barcode and you are able to get the points or the credits in the app to help you to renew your CEU credits. And we do have our next section. Just give me this. is on Monday, March 8th. So Karen is going to host this section. The topic is on fertigation, integrating nutrients with irrigation options. So if you don't register for this section yet, please go to our website, perennia.ca, to register for this section. And we also have another 4 after this one. So the information will be available after we get all our guest speakers and the section details ready, and we will post and open the registration links to everybody. We do have a survey. We will send a survey to you shortly after the presentation and the section today. We will pick one winner to have an irrigation menu for this winner. So please complete the survey and tell us how we do today. We appreciate your feedback and your comments. So myself, I'm the wild blueberry specialist. This is my email address, and Karen Condon, vegetable specialist acting and field crop specialist. Her email address here as well. Feel free to send us any questions or comments or feedback about our presentation and about our seminar.